Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to Boston University in the Castle this evening for what is the first ever joint lecture between the Institute for the Study of Muslim Societies and Civilizations, the Boston University Center for the Study of Asia, as well as the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies. Say that 3 times fast. You'll be very impressed. Before we begin tonight, I actually want to take this moment to just do a couple of shameless plugs for some events that we have coming up next week. Both of them are related to the arts and may be of interest to some of you or your students. The first is a BU Center for the Study of Asia event that will be happening on Monday, where Professor Ebba Koch will be joining us, who is a cartographer and an art historian, who will be speaking on the symbolic possession of the world, European cartography, Mughal allegory, and history painting. That will be held again on Monday between 4 and 6 p.m. at the School of Management, room 228. Additionally, for those of you who are here, because Afghanistan is obviously a topic that's important to many of you, next Tuesday we'll be having another Afghanistan-related event, this one that will be dealing specifically with the arts, where we will be having Corinne Jaber, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who will be talking a lecture on negotiating the arts in Afghanistan. That'll be held on Tuesday, March 8th at 4 o'clock at the Terrace Lounge in the GSU. I think it'll be an interesting perspective, especially for all of us that spend way too much time dealing with security studies in Afghanistan. So we'd like to invite you to come and watch that as well. Now to the main event. It is my honor this evening to introduce Thomas Barfield, who is the professor of anthropology here at Boston University, as well as the president of the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies, and one of my many bosses. He will be speaking to us tonight because he has over 4 decades of experience in research and topics related to Afghanistan. Additionally, he's also done substantial work on the nomadic peoples throughout all of Central and Western and even Eastern Asia. And I think he proposed some rather interesting ideas for all of us. It's quite fitting tonight that this is the first lecture for all 3 of these centers combined, given the topic. Afghanistan, as many of you know, has a rather rich history, and Professor Barfield's new book, Afghanistan, A Cultural and Political History, covers approximately 6 centuries of that history, tracing Afghanistan as an area that began as a crossroads of Asia, later became the ground setting for the Great Game between the British and Russian empires, followed by the graveyard of those empires. Needless, I need to say, of course, the current situation in Afghanistan is probably the main reason why many of you are here this evening. Tom Barfield will be talking about his recent book and how, despite all of these changes over the last 6 centuries, the Afghan people and their culture have remained remarkably the same. The text itself concludes with some rather interesting possibilities and projections about the future of Afghanistan, which I hope we can get out of him this evening. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Tom Barfield. Lynn, please welcome.
Well, I want to thank you all for turning out. Fortunately, we didn't have snow, which we seem to have had it forever. I just actually returned from Afghanistan. I spent about 10 days there, kind of 2 weeks ago, so I feel sort of fresh from the field. But one of the things that one realizes in looking at Afghanistan and talking to people about it is that it is a land of paradoxes. But unfortunately, it tends to be a land of unresolved paradoxes. That is, people say, wow, how can you have this and that together? Now, the Afghans on many occasions have actually played these paradoxes to their own advantage. That is, they've declared the place to be unconquerable, and yet, as we'll see, if it's unconquerable, how was it known earlier as the highway of conquest? And I want to deal with some of these paradoxes, take us into the questions of how they've set up politics in Afghanistan, and hopefully end up a little bit with what are the implications for the United States and the international community in Afghanistan. First to the paradoxes. Even the New York Times has breathlessly stated on many occasions that no one has ever conquered Afghanistan. They'll tell you, not Genghis Khan, not Babur, the conqueror of India, not Genghis Khan, not Alexander the Great. Unfortunately, their archives only go back to 1860 or so. They didn't realize actually Genghis Khan did conquer it. He burned most of it down. He didn't stick around having burned it down. And Alexander the Great, of course he conquered it. You know, he just made a few wrong turns, people say. He went up the Kunar Valley and they threw rocks on him. Okay, yeah, they did. And then he realized he had made a wrong turn and went down the Khyber Pass to conquer India. However, his descendants, or his general's descendants, ruled Afghanistan for the next 2 centuries. And some of the most fantastic Greco-Bactrian art and coins comes from that era. And more importantly, the very people that threw rocks on him in the Kunar Valley, now in Nuristan, say we are the descendants of Alexander the Great. So talk about, you know, maybe losing a battle but winning the war. We are the descendants of Alexander the Great. Well, why'd you throw rocks on your ancestor? Well, we didn't keep track of that. So if you look at it, what you see is that in fact everybody essentially before 1840 did conquer Afghanistan. And it's sort of one of the questions, well, why were they able to do it? Because after 1840, which is the denouement of the first Anglo-Afghan War, the country gets a reputation as the graveyard of empires, you know, which the Afghans polish up, because the Afghans have used this graveyard of empires trope in what I call a pufferfish strategy. It's actually a poor, weak nation. So how do you convince people not to attack you? Like the pufferfish, you blow up. Graveyard of empires. Do not come here. Now, this keeps most away. Do not come there. When the United States was going in, graveyard of empire. Mullah Omar said, yeah, graveyard of empires. And he was gone in 10 weeks, something I'll get back to. But they do have a strategy like the pufferfish, which has a special poisonous liver, which the Japanese managed to cut up very carefully to give a tingling on your lips. Unless it kills you. I mean, so it's an interesting thing to do. But if you eat a pufferfish, it will make you sick. So you'll never want to eat another. So that's sort of the history of Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the pufferfish that is eaten, the rest of the pufferfish benefit, but not the one that is eaten. And so when Afghanistan is invaded, this is like you get eaten. They say, no, we're going to do this again. But in the meantime, you left the bones of a pufferfish behind you. So how is it possible then for all these people to rule Afghanistan? And then why did it change? So let me go over that pretty quickly. And one of the reasons for that was to understand what is political legitimacy? What makes a ruler legitimate so that people don't rebel against him? And this was the essence of how people conquered Afghanistan. Because in the Islamic world, essentially de facto control turned into almost automatic legitimacy. They took a very Hobbesian view of the political realm. Hobbes, as you may remember, was the guy famous for nasty, brutish, and short as the state of nature, for lifespans. But anyway, he argued in favor of kings and tyrants on the ground, that civil war was worse. Therefore, you should put up with any horrible king, because to rebel against him was illegitimate and would just make life worse for you. In Central Asia, this was also the belief. And we see this also in sort of Arab political science, in the idea that unrest creates fitna. Fitna is unrest, sedition, civil war. And the basic traditional belief on this is that civil war, sedition, fitna was worse than a bad ruler. So don't rebel. So it's very Hobbesian. You need a ruler, it's never going to be one of your friends, so get used to it. All you needed to be a ruler was take over a place. They read, they had the Friday Islamic sermon, the khutbah, read in your name and you mint some coins. And you're legitimate. Until the next guy shows up and throws you out of the mosque, then he's legitimate. Okay? So it's rather easy to get legitimacy. But why would people accept these rulers, particularly in places like Afghanistan? Well, one of the reasons was, again, to avoid disruption, but also because fundamentally, when many parts of Afghanistan or Afghans say, we've never been conquered, you have to ask, what's never been conquered in Afghanistan? It is true, for example, the Kunar Valley, Paktika, the northwest frontier areas. These people proudly say, we have never been conquered by anyone. The answer to that question is, who would bother? right? It's not worth the price of administration. So what you see in this entire realm is you want to control areas that are important economically or strategically. So you need to control the Khyber Pass. But the guys that live 2 hills over, you don't need them. So they proudly announce from the hilltops, we are free people. And the Mughal emperors or Genghis Khan said, and you can remain free, okay? Because you're not worth taxing. So instead what would happen was punitive campaigns, marriage alliances, trade embargoes, but not ruling directly. And this leads me then to, if we have to understand the style of rule that these leaders did, it was a peculiar one that's sort of alien to our sensibilities and actually leads us into problems today in Afghanistan. That is, our point of view of looking, the Western point of view of looking at how you rule a place, I call an American cheese model. Now, American cheese, as you may know, is highly processed. All the cheese looks the same and pretty much tastes the same, yes. But the deal is that all cheese slices are alike, all right? If you see a hole in an American cheese, it is a defect. You send it back. Sir, somebody's eaten my cheese. You know, it goes back. Now, the Afghan, Central Asia, what I call Turco-Persia from the Ottoman Empire, pretty much over to northern India, did not use the American cheese model. The Chinese did. They built a Great Wall. You know, everything south of it is cheese. Everything north of it is barbarians. Or should be the other way, because the barbarians ate the cheese and the Chinese. Anyway, that's a whole different lecture. The Asian Center can sponsor something. But the style of rule in Central Asia is what I call the Swiss cheese model. When you order a slice of Swiss cheese, each slice is different, and it all comes with holes. And you send it back. Sir, there's a hole in my cheese. Of course, it's Swiss cheese. The hole comes with the cheese. All right. Now, if you're a Turco-Persian ruler, you've got this cheese model in your head. When you see a hole, you don't fill it. That's how the cheese comes. You rule the cheese and ignore the holes. Very little of Afghanistan is cheese. All right, the irrigated valleys, the major urban areas, and places like deep in the Hindu Kush, they're the holes. You do not have one law to rule them all, you know, in front of the eye of Mordor. Because the Chinese or Western view is there is one law that is the same whether you're in the capital or the remotest frontier. It's got to be the same. Not in Afghanistan. There's the law of the city, there's the government in the irrigated territory, and those guys in the mountains. And this doesn't have to do so much with your ability to move into those mountains, because even the British, at the height of their Victorian colonial hubris, created the federally administered tribal areas, which says, we're not going to even try to govern these guys, because it's not worth it. Now there's one of the world's most powerful empires, and they bequeathed to us this ungoverned territory. Why? Because they've been in India a long time. They looked at Mughal history, they looked at Afghan history and said, you know what, let these guys shoot each other. Come down to Peshawar, we'll shoot at you, and if you cause any trouble, we'll recruit your kinsmen as the Khyber rice wolves, and they'll shoot back at you. But it's an ungoverned territory. So much of Afghanistan was ungoverned, unconquerable, but that's not the part that foreign conquerors were interested in holding. So what we see is before 1840, essentially, people ruling the cheesy bits and letting the mountains, letting the deserts do what they want. This allows you to have a huge, huge empire with a minimal amount of force. And if you look at something like the ancient Persian Empire, which is just huge, it's like 3 times the size of the Roman Empire, it's because there's a lot of holes in it. You know, if you're in southern Afghanistan and you look at Helmand Valley, what you see is a huge irrigated area right along the river, kind of like the Nile. And then on one side you have the desert of death and the land of endless sand. Right? You know, it's not, you know, that name tells you something. So, you know, if you're Mullah Omar, you're going to say, good guys, if we're in trouble, we retreat to the endless desert of sand or the desert of death. It's a problem. Okay. Now, so what we have then is a way to rule Afghanistan, which was highly effective up until 1840. Another thing that was effective was, well, who ruled Afghanistan during these periods? Modern Afghan history begins in 1747 with the first Pashtun Empire. And if you go to Afghanistan today, they'll say the Pashtuns have always been in charge because we're the meanest people and we deserve everything. But if you say, well, wait a minute, what were you guys doing before 1747? They kind of look at the ceiling like, well, because it turns out the whole place was ruled by Turks and Mongols, or Turkified Persians. These are the horse-riding people that come out of Central Asia. Originally from Mongolia, they move into Central Asia, and these are the people that established dynasties, Turkish dynasties, from the Ottoman Empire to Iran to even northern India. Babur, the famous Mughal dynasty, was originally a Turk. These guys have an unusual way of organizing their tribes. That is, yeah, they're horse riding, they shoot arrows, they move really fast, but one of the most important things, if you can unify these people politically, the dynasty that unifies them is considered not only set for life, but set for centuries. It's a royal dynasty. These are hierarchical tribes in which people are organized into common clans and noble clans, and the royal clan, only people that compete for power are in this noble clan. Now, if you go to the Arab world, like the Bedouins, or even the Pashtuns, what we find is the tribes are highly egalitarian. Everybody believes he can be the chief. Do you know how hard it is to organize people where everybody wants your job and thinks he can have it? Indeed, in Pashto, one of the greatest competitions is called Tarbur Wali, the competition among patrilineal first cousins. That is, the person that's supposed to be your closest kinsman is also your greatest rival. So this makes it what Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century Arab social historian, said. This means that you never really have rulers. You have chieftains that have to convince everybody to follow you every day. This is a lot of work. The Turco-Mongolians, they have royal authority. They know how to give orders and people accept them. Well, it turns out the people that ruled Afghanistan up until the mid-18th century came out of this Turkish-Mongolian tradition. When the Afghans take over, where did they learn their style of government? Not sitting around a tribal jirga arguing, like, we are all equal. No, they went to work for the Turks and Mongols, and the Turks taught them a trick. Somebody has to be in charge, it could be you. So, when one of the famous Persian dynasties fell apart, the Pashtuns took over and said, we are the royal dynasty, the Durrani royal dynasty. And how did they sell that to the other Pashtuns? They said, well, choose somebody else to replace us. And they all argued, well, we hate you, but we can't stand each other. We get a dynasty that runs 230 years, from 1747 to 1978. So if you think, when people say, oh, Afghanistan is totally ungovernable, how come it had a dynasty that lasted 230 years? On the other hand, there is this substrate of egalitarianism, because as Ibn Khaldun predicted, in egalitarian societies, dynasties tend to turn over every 3 or 4 generations. The royal dynasty that rules for 230 years has internal revolutions every 3 or 4 generations when different lineages replace one another. But nobody else can compete. And who finally overthrows this dynasty in 1978? The communists. But it turns out it's the non-royal communists. They finally got even. But you can't say, we finally have our tribal revenge. No, you say we're doing it in the name of socialism. But if you looked at it, no. They said, we finally know how to do this. And then they were such egalitarian communists that they had 2 communist parties and began shooting each other. Such that the Soviets invaded. But that's yet to come. Okay, so if we look at this, well, why did the situation change? Why was a place that essentially was so easy to conquer and rule, why, when the British came in, did it become so difficult? Because it's with the first Anglo-Afghan War, when the British invade Afghanistan in 1839, that we begin to get this. But if you look closely, what you find is the British were not stupid when they moved in. They brought an old Afghan king with them, actually one that had more legitimacy than the usurper that was sitting in Kabul. And they were accepted. The problem is, after they were accepted, they had the Western bias of saying, well, it's an okay place, but it could use some improvement, like a government. So the first thing they did was cut all the subsidies to the tribal leaders who were in charge of putting troops into the field. Now, these troops were absolutely useless, but the British commander in charge of giving out the subsidies explained that of course they're useless, but this is a major form of patronage. And when you cut it off, you piss off a lot of people. They said, that's okay, we'll cut them all off, we'll create 3 regiments of modern forces and beat them up if they have trouble. Well, they might have been able to do that, but then, and this may sound familiar, when the bill for the Afghan campaign got delivered in London, they said, it costs what? They said, you've got to cut costs. You know, you just got to cut costs. We just can't afford this. So naturally, where, if you're a foreign army, where do you cut costs? Not in the support of your troops or your cigar supply train or anything else that was coming up, because the British lived very well in Kabul this time. They said, let's cut the subsidies to the tribal chieftains that guard the Khyber Pass, because we don't have a war anymore, so we don't need them. And the guy said, well, wait a minute, you know, inflation has happened, we want more subsidies. No, less subsidies. And suddenly they discovered Islam and nationalism began attacking the British. At the same time in Kabul, because the British were spending so much money, inflation took place. And all the people in the old regime that were getting their money from landed estates, or they were on stipends like mullahs or government officials, they were losing. Who was gaining? People like merchants. The Afghans still say they corrupted the women of Kabul. Well, no, the women of Kabul were free to go where the money was, and that really pissed a lot of people off. The whole social structure was being overturned. So if what we see is actually an insurgency in Afghanistan did not begin with the arrival of the British. The British created an insurgency. But once they had done that, Afghan leaders realized there's no way we can get rid of foreign invaders with a regular army. Afghan regular armies have always been defeated. They've never been able to protect the country. Insurgencies have driven the foreigners out. What is the strategy of the insurgency? Because in most cases, they rarely win a fair fight. But then they say, well, why should we fight fair? I mean, you know, you guys win fair fights, we win the other fights. But the other thing that they say with foreigners is, we live here and want to be in Afghanistan, and you don't. So you'll get out. And that usually works pretty well. Now, the question is, if you're a ruler in Afghanistan, how do you encourage your people to revolt against foreigners? And then when the foreigners leave, stop them from revolting against you. This has been the great dilemma pretty much of all Afghan rulers. Because, you know, essentially this popular rebellion broke the old tradition in which ordinary people have no role in government. It's only a fight between the elites. In order to get rid of the foreigners in the 19th century, you had to mobilize a population. Then you had to say, well, really, you guys have no role in government. This became, over the next 100, 150 years, a progressively harder sell to put people back in their box. So what we find, interestingly enough, is that Afghan rulers work out a very crafty, mendacious policy of becoming or declaring themselves pro-Islamic, xenophobic, defenders of Afghan nationhood, and at the same time going to the foreigners and saying, but you really need to fund our government. And managing to convince both the Afghans and the foreigners that they are absolutely necessary. To the foreigners, they would go, without me in Kabul, these Afghans would be overrunning India, so you better pay me. And to the Afghans, without me, those foreigners would be overrunning the country, so don't revolt. And they had to be convincing on both sides. Now this is a really tough act to do. But the greatest Afghan rulers managed to pull it off. And effectively, when people say today, how can the Afghans pay for the army we're building them? The Afghans haven't paid for an army in 150 years. The whole policy of Afghanistan's government is to get somebody else to pay, right? This is like a Republican dream world, where there's not only no taxes, you get paid a stipend. It's kind of like Alaska, where, you know, they rail against the government and they cash their government oil check. Or New Hampshire, we don't pay for nothing. When they're getting sick, they come to Boston, the land of socialism, where we know how to Anyway, Afghan leaders have been really good at this, because what they realized was, if they got money from foreigners, then they didn't have to tax their own people. And there's nothing people dislike more than being taxed. So over periods of time, what we see is, in general, Afghan governments attempt to see, how can we mulct the foreigners and then pull out of oppressing our own population? Because a traditional state, essentially, you tax a peasant population, run for a military. But that's tough in Afghanistan. So Afghan rulers realized, you know, we don't need to do this if we can convince the foreigners to pay for a state. But why should foreigners pay for a state? In the late 19th century, let's say 1870s, there was a term called Afghanistan Ism that the British applied to parliamentarians that were constantly railing about distant and unimportant places. The irony was that the Afghans always brought Afghanistanism back to, oh my God, there's a problem. How do they do this? By understanding that Afghanistan could play off international rivalries. And effectively, in the 19th century, it's the rivalry between Britain and Russia. Britain is always concerned that somebody's going to attack India via Afghanistan. And as the Russians moved through Central Asia, it looked like, wow, they're going to do it. Well, actually, it goes before. The first time the British had any dealings with Afghanistan, it was because they were afraid Napoleon was going to march from Egypt all the way across the Middle East and down the Khyber Pass. Of course, at that time, you got to realize the British didn't even own the Punjab. I mean, you know, it's incredible paranoia, but the Afghans picked up on this really quick. Yeah, we've been writing Napoleon. He's a really great guy. He's a Muslim, yeah. And oh no, we'll give you arms, yeah. So they played off of this, and they became a buffer state. And some people say, well, that's an artificial state. Well, what state's artificial? Look to the south of us at Rhode Island, okay? There's a lot of artificial states around. Doesn't mean they can't exist. But the Afghans essentially were the only country that was never colonized, in part because they played off the rivalry between the British and the Russians and held on to their own territory. So much so that if you look at a map of Afghanistan, you'll see that there's this part sticking out, the Wakhan corridor that goes all the way to China, which is an integral part of the Afghan nation. But you say, wait a minute, how did that happen? Well, it turned out that the British and Russians were looking at the maps, and there was a 19th century belief that European empires should never touch, because then your border guards might be shooting at each other, getting the capitals into a war, so there should always be an area between, like in Southeast Asia, the French had Cambodia and Vietnam, and then you had Thailand, and you had Britain. No way they could come in conflict. As the Russians moved down, it looked like Afghanistan's the buffer state, but they didn't know the geography, and suddenly they realized there's this mountains area, the source of the Oxus, the Wakhan corridor, that the two empires do touch. So they immediately sent up a boundary commission. They walked all the way to, they found a sleeping Chinese border guard, declared this is China, and drew a 10-mile corridor and went to the king of Afghanistan and said, this is now Afghanistan. He said, it's never been Afghanistan and I won't take it. He said, you must take it. It is an imperial necessity. He says, okay, give me 1,000,000 rupees, I'll do it. So they did. Now it's an integral part of Afghanistan. But that was how Afghan rulers took advantage of this. In the 20th century, they moved on, because World War I kind of wrecked a lot of what was going on. But you could worry about the British and the Soviet Union, but that wasn't a really good one. The really good one was the Afghans decided they needed to look far beyond the Russians and the British and find some other patrons, and the first one was Germany. This started in the First World War when the Turks and the Germans show up in Kabul and say, join us in a war against the British and the Russians. The Afghans said, this is really good, we don't like either of those guys. But they said it has to be a secret agreement, because if the British discovered this, they'd be really angry. So they agreed that when the Germans showed up on Afghan soil with gold and guns, they together would attack British India. Well, they never showed up. So they remained a secret treaty. Same thing in the Second World War. They showed up. And actually, just before the Second World War, the largest loan to develop Afghanistan was obtained from the Reichsbank. This was Hitler's way to go into Central Asia. He also sent explorers there. That's when sort of this Aryan ideology. I mean, many Afghans up until that time had thought they were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. The Germans informed them they were Aryans. Oh, okay. So today, Afghan Airlines, a lot of this amazing amount of sort of fascist pseudoscience that floats around all from Xinjiang, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan. It's still remembered there. It's very strange, but it's there. So, but there was an attempt, because the Afghans said it is better to get a foreign power who does not border you, because that way, if he gives you money, he can't want your land. So they first went to Japan. The Japanese weren't interested. They went to the United States, but the Nazis were. Unfortunately for them, World War II broke out. and they deep sixed that treaty because they didn't want to be divided like Iran or overrun like Iraq. So what we have, however, here is a look that Afghan rulers, unlike their populations, are incredibly sophisticated internationally. That's how they make their state work. And as we'll see, it's an explanation for, so how did somebody like Hamid Karzai get to be ruler of Afghanistan? He's not the toughest warlord, you know, didn't have much of a reputation. But he was a flashy dresser, knew all languages, and if you need money, hey, when Hamid Karzai shows up at the European Parliament or Congress, smiles, puts on one of his many hats, you want to give him money. At least we did a number of years ago. If one of these warlords shows up with his gap teeth and his sneaky look, he says, oh no, we don't want to give money to these guys. The interesting thing is the warlords of Afghanistan understand this. They said, you know, we don't speak these languages, we look like thieves, let's hire somebody that fits the part. Because they understand there's this relationship. Now this is a very sophisticated understanding that we sometimes underestimate when we're doing international politics with Afghanistan. So when we're looking at it, what we see is essentially for 150 years an important understanding of how you play off world powers. And of course, the most recent one that they dealt with was during the 50s and 60s and 70s, the Soviet-American rivalry. Almost all the infrastructure you see in Afghanistan is built as part of that rivalry. The Russians built the army, the Americans built the education, Russians built most of the north-south roads, the Americans built the east-west roads, and it was in a very effective way to do it because the Afghans kept saying, well, if you don't give us something, we just might join the other side. And they had this reputation for side switching, so you worried about it. And I think the best example of this was they got the Soviets to build concrete grain silos, and they got the Americans to fill them. All over the country. They kind of knew what each side could do best. Russian concrete was really good, grain not so hot. Us, the opposite. So when we look at it, what we see going into the 20th century is a country at an elite level, which is quite sophisticated dealing with the outside world, but has problems internally, and they're problems that we're dealing with now. Because I would argue there, in the 20th century, there's three periods that effectively rulers in Afghanistan attempt to modernize the country. They attempt to change the way things are run internally. And this is a much more difficult problem in dealing with the outside world. So we got our first period between 1901 and 1929, when during the 1920s, post First World War, Afghanistan was actually at the lead in change in the Muslim world. Amanullah, the king at that time, was on par with Ataturk in Turkey or Reza Shah in Iran. In fact, in some ways, he was more progressive. The difficulty, unlike Iran or Turkey, he didn't have much in the way of a governmental structure. And when he took a vacation in Europe, 9 months, and was gone, when he came back and decided this is a really primitive place and I'm going to change it tomorrow, all hell broke loose. It blew up. There was a revolt. And the irony was the most conservative bandit, this guy that the Pashtuns call Bacha Sakhal, son of a water carrier. But he was a Tajik bandit. His real name was Habibullah. He took over and he spoke in the name of reaction. I'm going to take everything back to the past. In fact, it was said, I don't know what's apocryphal, that he put his throne room actually in the bathroom of the palace because it was covered in lapis lazuli. Now the bathrooms, you must understand, in Afghanistan do not have toilets. They are truly just for baths. Afghans consider, how do you put a toilet and a bathtub together? It's like so yucky, you know. And actually, when you begin to think about it, yeah, that's cultural things. Maybe they're right, you know. Anyway, nobody told, you know, the bandit Emir that this wasn't, he says, the best looking room in the palace. Anyway, he's thrown out of power by the very tribes that overthrew the modernist Emir on the grounds that they didn't want that much reaction, you know, and particularly they wanted one of the whole Pashtun kings back. So we got Zahir Shah's father who takes over. And here we have a new and the longest period of peace in Afghanistan from 1929 to 1978. The dynasty was known as the Musahiban dynasty, and it was a do-nothing dynasty. And incredibly successful at doing nothing. because it followed the Wizard of Oz strategy. That is, if you cause any trouble, we will crush you. We've got an army. And so I said, well, we better not cause any trouble for these people. On the other hand, they never asked anybody to do anything. And in terms of taxes under Amanullah, 2/3 of the government revenue came from land and animal taxes, which had to be collected from people every year. By 1973, land and animal taxes accounted for less than 1% of the Afghan budget. Almost all the budget was in foreign aid, loans, taxes on trade, so effectively the government withdrew. And as they modernized the army, they put down 1 or 2 small rebellions. But people thought, we shouldn't take this on, besides there's no reason to take it on. The difficulty was, in terms of, you can do nothing, but Afghanistan was changing. As a result of all of the foreign aid that was coming in, the education, the infrastructure. In the 1960s, there was jobs for everybody, meaning mostly in the government. But in the 1970s, the jobs disappeared. The government was full, but there was really no economy. And this is when we find the parties beginning to come up that say this do-nothing dynasty needs to be thrown out. You had 2 factions. One was essentially the communist faction that said, we need to go back to Amanullah, change this country, and change it radically. And then you had the Islamists that said, we should focus on an Islamic regime. They were much smaller and didn't have much in the way of an economic policy. But in 1978, the communists take power. And largely it's the subaltern groups that were sort of left out of the old regime. They take over. But within 9 months, the place is falling apart. Now here we have a very interesting case that comes up in terms of how a reputation can come back to bite. The second communist leader, by the name of Hafizullah Amin, was a really tough guy. And the Soviets were worried. They tried to overthrow him, but he had discovered the coup, killed the first communist leader, and began to cut the Soviets out. Okay? And began meeting secretly with the Americans. I don't know, is Charlie Dunbar here? Yes, Charlie. Because they met with our own BU, faculty member, Charlie Dunbar. He's living.
No. I was not there at that time. They met with Archblood.
They met with the embassy.
He was the charge at the end.
He was the charge because they had killed the American ambassador at the time, so he didn't have one.
It was more complicated than that.
Well, we will let Charlie finish it out. But what happened was the Russians believed that the communists were about to defect to the Americans. And we have this from Politburo papers. Now, this doesn't make any sense at all, but from an Afghan perspective, the belief of side-switching, the belief that this could happen, actually induced the Soviets to invade, to get rid of Hafizullah Amin, and they figured it'd be just like Czechoslovakia, we'll be out of here in a few months. They were there for 10 years. And this also changed the way Afghanistan dealt with outsiders, because in the 19th century, what we had was a situation in which insurgencies essentially lasted only about 18 months. The British weren't there for that long, but the Soviets were there for 10 years. Their counterinsurgency was one, if you oppose us, we will destroy you. They killed 1 million Afghans. 4 million Afghans became refugees. You had war-induced urbanization. So in other words, we had a situation where Afghanistan was, and its society was totally turned upside down. So one of the difficulties when people say, well, Afghanistan has state collapsed in the past and put it back together, why is it so difficult now? It is so difficult now, essentially because of this 10-year period, when the traditional system was pretty much turned upside down. So many people were killed, so many people were displaced, and it's really hard to go back to what existed before, as much as people tend to sort of idolize the past as a result of that. The other thing that happened, however, is that when the Soviets withdrew, they put in a very powerful member, the former leader of the secret police, who managed to hold on to Afghanistan when they withdrew. Same strategy as rulers when the British were there. He received money and guns and said the foreigners are gone, and managed to turn it from an insurgency into a relatively small-scale civil war. And the Mujahideen factions that were sitting in Pakistan found they were unable to get rid of this, quote, communist government. because Najibullah, the head of the government, said, no communists here. He actually called in all the Communist Party cards in Burma and replaced them with Watan, National Party. Congratulations, you're all nationalists now. But what he was able to do essentially was to play this local level politics. And in some ways, you begin to see a very similar strategy to what's going on now. Suddenly all these local militias are rising up. The central government devolves power, that, you know, there's an essence of power sharing regionalism that goes on. But the interesting thing about it is that he manages to survive the Soviet withdrawal, but he cannot survive the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. Because fundamentally, if an Afghan regime is receiving support from the outside, nobody assumes that the world imperial power is going to collapse on you. I mean, Afghanistan is supposed to collapse, not the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union collapsed, that meant no more guns, no more money. Now, the Soviets had delivered, in advance, 2 years worth of weapons and money. They could have held on, but they did a strategy. From that point on, they realized we're going to get weaker and weaker. And so what happens? We see a collapse of the communist government, but it is side-switching on a massive scale. The most radical communists join with the most radical Islamists. Why? Because now we're fighting an ethnic-based war, and the most radical communists are Pashtuns or the most radical Islamists. There's a switch, and we get the very nasty civil war in the 1990s that leads to the rise of the Taliban. Why do we get this? In part because this is the only period of time in the last 150 years in Afghanistan when no major world power was interested in Afghanistan at all. So effectively, the only people playing politics in Afghanistan, supporting groups in Afghanistan, were the neighbors of Pakistan. They're much poorer neighbors, like Pakistan. It first supports radical groups like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Hizb-i Islami, but when he fails, they go for the Taliban. And the Taliban managed to succeed, in part because they're fighting in a vacuum. They're fighting in an area that the rest of the world couldn't care about. Now, the United States had promised the Afghans, something the Afghans still remember, is that when the communists collapse, we will help you reconstruct. We will help you rebuild. But when it happened, we were nowhere to be found. We had pulled out of the region. We had discovered that Pakistan was making a nuclear weapon, and you know that's against American law. So we pulled out all of our money. And one of the reasons we pulled it out is the belief is we will never need to be back in this region again. What possible problem could come from this region? Look at it. It's a land of donkeys and camels. I mean, you know. And then we discovered, well, it may be a land of donkeys and camels, but the people who are living there don't necessarily intend to attack us using donkeys and camels. And the interesting thing about that is that we were focusing on the Taliban, who were very nationalistic. They weren't interested in other people's jihads. And they were kind of Afghan chauvinists. We won our jihad, you should win yours. You know, they would cheer. Would you ever see an Afghan join another jihad? No. Okay. They didn't do it, you know? Like, and if you look at it, those of you who are familiar with the Cold War terminology will realize that in the early communist period, there was debate between the Trotskyites who believed in world communist revolution in all countries, and Stalinists who said, there'll be socialist revolution in one country, mine. And the rest of it, I'm not going to worry about. Allowed him to cut deals with capitalism. Osama bin Laden is an Islamic Trotskyite, looking for world Islamic revolution. Mullah Omar, he's a Stalinist. He wanted his emirate in one country. If it expanded, great. But he really didn't care. On the other hand, and here we see one of the difficulties in terms of breaks in patterns. In the past, all previous leaders of Afghanistan had been specialists and certainly understood the international environment in which they lived and how to manipulate it. Mullah Omar did not. Mullah Omar had, I don't think he'd ever been to Lahore or Karachi, maybe, but you know, the best he had done was like Quetta and Peshawar, at best, all right? So his view of the world was rather narrow. How can the United States attack us? I don't even know where it is. Now, this actually reminded me, when I was in Afghanistan doing my initial field work in the 70s, I was in a nomad camp, and head nomad came up on his motorcycle because he had been listening to the radio. Thought go out to the Dosh, the nice spring pastures, and give me the news that the Vietnam War was over and we had lost. I said, well, what do you mean we lost? Oh yeah, we heard on the radio, helicopters leaving Saigon. I said, yeah, it's over. And I said, well, this isn't so good for you. You live right on the border of the Soviet Union. It's right across there. Oh, we'll beat them with sticks if they come. Don't worry about it. But then we got into an argument about where the United States was. Because they said, well, yeah, it's next to Vietnam. I said, it's not next to Vietnam. I live there. It's not. And they said, oh, yes, it is. Because Afghans can be very sure of themselves. I said, we listened on the radio. There's Afghanistan, there's Pakistan, there's Hindustan, there's Bangladesh, which I thought was the funniest name they'd ever heard of. And then there's Vietnam, meaning Southeast Asia. And then there's America. I said, no, there's a huge ocean. The Amu Darya River that's just down the road, like 1,000 times that. No, it isn't. I said, I live there. It isn't. It is not next to Vietnam. And they said, oh yeah? You can't fight a war with a country unless you're next to it. And I said, well, if we had thought about that, we wouldn't have been in this trouble. But so when you're looking at Mullah Omar, that's kind of his attitude as well. It's way far away, and so what could they do? And he said he had taken Osama's cell phone from him, so how much trouble could he cause the United States? Mullah Omar was a bit out of it. So after 9/11, it is very interesting, the Bush administration did not put the Taliban on the terrorist list because it gave Mullah Omar a choice. It said, hey, you turn over Osama bin Laden, all is forgiven. We won't ask you about all these burqas you've been making. We don't really care. You run Afghanistan the way you want. But he wouldn't do it. Now, and this also showed any traditional Afghan ruler, Pashtunwali, any other codes aside, they turn in their brother if they could hold on to the state. I mean, the whole essence of being an Oriental potentate is no one is to be trusted. Not Mullah Omar. He stood on principle. 10 weeks later, he was riding a motorcycle to Quetta, asking how it could have all gone wrong. Because his belief was, just like when the Soviets come in, all Afghans will rise against the Americans. But they didn't. First of all, there were only 400 Americans on the ground. So if we look at how the United States, quote, beat the Taliban, we supplied the money, because we print $100 bills, so we had a lot of them. We had air power, but effectively all the war in terms of the negotiations, the fighting, was essentially all done by Afghan factions. And why did the Afghan factions go against Mullah Omar, go against the name of Islam? Number one, because they didn't like him very much. And they didn't like having people telling them what kind of Muslims they should be. They're the world's best Muslims, so how can you tell us how to be better Muslims? It's an oxymoron. But they were waiting. They were waiting to see who's going to win, who's going to lose. And the day the city of Mazar Sharif in northern Afghanistan fell to this famous cavalry charge of Uzbeks against an in-place tank position. Now, the last time this had been done was the Polish army against the Wehrmacht, and it didn't work out very well. But in this case, you had laser-guided bombs, took it out, and Mazar Sharif fell. As soon as that happened, everybody thought, in Afghanistan, this means the Taliban are losers. And in Afghanistan, the perception of power is power itself. We do not see regimes rising and falling slowly. We see almost instantaneously, and also if we look at Afghan history, we never find a decisive battle. Why? Because the night before the decisive battle, people decide who's going to win, and they sneak over to the winning side, and in the morning, the loser wakes up, and he's a loser. He doesn't know how it happened, but he knows how to read the tea leaves, okay? He leaves. That's what happened to Mullah Omar. That's what happened to Osama bin Laden. There he is up in his mountain fortress being bombed, saying, where's my Afghan help? Now, the Afghan help also allowed him to buy his way out, on principle, it was not their fight. But if we look at it, we saw this rise and fall based on perception of power, and also the Taliban weren't particularly popular. So when the United States came in, why wasn't there an immediate, or at least within a year, an insurgency that broke out? Instead, it took an insurgency almost 4 years to come about. Because the United States and the international coalition effectively put an end to an Afghan civil war that the Afghans were unable to bring to a close themselves, and it put to an end the interference in Afghanistan by neighboring countries, particularly Pakistan. So the Afghans essentially looked forward to the international community, rebuilding the country, bringing order to the country, and allowing Afghanistan essentially to become a normal, stable state. Unfortunately, the Bush administration was all too keen to go to Iraq, put Afghanistan on the back burner. So what we discovered was too few forces. International forces were confined almost completely to Kabul. It wasn't that there was trouble elsewhere, but this allowed a power vacuum to emerge in which old warlords came back, the Taliban came back, essentially because there were no forces there. And after the United States invaded Iraq, its allies that continued to help in Afghanistan weren't interested in helping all that much. If, before going into Iraq, the United States had asked for troops, for example, from Turkey or from other Muslim countries, they might have gotten them, not after the Iraqi adventure. Secondly, people heard about all this wonderful aid, and huge amounts of money came in. The problem was people at the local level didn't see any of it. It disappeared. Daily life was not much improved. Security was not much improved. The government, which we helped put together with Loya Jirgos and elections and this and that, proved not only ineffective, it proved more and more corrupt. A great disappointment. Because the one thing, if we go back to what I was talking about earlier, rulers in Afghanistan, they owed their legitimacy by doing basic governmental functions, of which the first was maintaining order. And we seem to think that elections were the thing that was important, not so much maintaining order. And if you're a local population, you want to make sure that you can move from one town to another, that when you wake up in the morning, you're going to be able to go about your daily activities. The other thing that happened was that Pakistan continued essentially to double deal. That is, while it was named major non-NATO ally by the United States in the war on terror, at the same time it was supporting and reviving the Taliban in Pakistan as their backup. Pakistanis have always looked for what they call strategic depth in Afghanistan. It was like the Russian steppe that you could retreat back into. Who would want Afghanistan as strategic depth is beyond me. But nevertheless, this has always put a very difficult position, is how can you deal with a rising insurgency when it has a base in another country and that country is your supposed ally? It's a contradiction that we're still trying to work ourselves out. So what we see is that Afghanistan was effectively allowed to not only sit on the back burner, but was allowed to get worse and worse. And from Washington's point of view, as long as it didn't make the papers in this country, and given the bad news out of Iraq, it rarely did, it was a success. The problem is that by 2006, the Taliban were on the rise in southern Afghanistan and eastern Afghanistan, and we did have an insurgency that was taking place, but one that the international community was unwilling or unable to deal with. So when the Obama administration comes in, it has a big question: what do we do about Afghanistan? And it has no really good choices. If we had put a quarter of the effort that we're putting now in Afghanistan in 2003, 2004, we wouldn't have a problem. Difficulties, you can't go back again. And the question is, can you turn things around? One thing that you might, on the positive side, is that most Afghans do not want to fight a war for anybody's ideology. There was a farmer in Helmand who's reportedly said, look, I don't care whether the Americans win or the Taliban win. I want somebody to win so there's no more war around here. This in-between stage can be quite dangerous. The other thing is that particularly from a democratic point of view, I'm speaking Democratic Party point of view on Afghan policy, is if you simply take the advice of some on the left and say, let's just pull out, we don't care what happens then, you got a problem, because any attack that's made on the United States after that, whether it's come out of Afghanistan or not, will be blamed on you. Now, if Dick Cheney had become successor to George Bush, no problem, because he already told you, look, we're going to be attacked. I'm already a son of a bitch, and if I can't stop them, nobody can stop them. They're invincible on the right there, it's just like, but the Democrats have this problem on the right politically, so if you want to protect sort of your social liberal flank in terms of doing stuff, you got to worry about your military side, because that's where you're sort of subject to criticism. So there's some interesting American political calculations that come up here. But our biggest question is, now that sort of a surge of troops has gone in, maybe has turned, it's hard to say, has turned some of the Taliban gains in the south back, but people wonder, is that going to last? How long are the Americans around? When it looked like the Americans were going to get out this summer, Mullah Omar said, just wait 9 months. How hard can that be? Now it's sort of moved off to 2014. If you're a Taliban guy, you're saying, well, I can wait 6 months, but being shot at for the next 4 years, that's a problem. Also, Mullah Omar is sitting in Quetta, cheerleading. Go, guys, attack the Americans. Well, who's getting killed? You know, and the one thing in Afghanistan is that no faction, this is not like the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. Think about Afghan militias, whether it's the Taliban or warlords, anyway, as general contractors. The guy looks like he's in charge when you hire him to fix your house, but in reality, the electrician, the plumber, the bricklayer, they're all independent. They can take a hike, they can not work. And in Afghanistan, the guys at the bottom are always interested in selling out the guy on the top. This makes it hard to be a leader in Afghanistan, because you never trust the guys right at the bottom. So one of our problems in terms of when we're talking about negotiating, I would argue, is some great international peace jirga between Hamid Karzai and Mullah Omar. That's not how things get done in Afghanistan. There's never been a coalition. There's winners and losers in Afghanistan, not split the difference governments. But at the bottom, we've seen, if you're an Afghan ruler, you know, or an Afghan follower even, in the past 25 years, you've seen a president go, you've seen Afghan party chairman go, you've seen Mullah Omar go, you've seen Hamid Karzai come, maybe he's going to go, but you've seen an awful lot of promises that have not been fulfilled, and you've got to take care of yourself. So it makes for a very volatile situation. Now, is it possible to bring about stability in Afghanistan? Well, one of the things I would say is that we may not be looking at the right lens in some ways, because in the current situation it looks completely unstable. But if we look at some of the other things that are happening, we may be about to be in a position when the neighbors of Afghanistan decide a stable Afghanistan is in their interest. And this largely has to do with developments, I mean economic developments. The United States has little or no involvement in, so we don't follow them. First thing, India has built a paved 6-lane highway from the Iranian port of Charbahar to the Afghan border. For the first time in Afghanistan's landlocked history, you can get to Afghanistan by sea without going through Pakistan. And who built the road? India, Pakistan's mortal enemy. And who would give you free petrol to go to Afghanistan if the Americans left, the Iranians? I mean, they'd love to see us out, and the Indians. It's one thing that could happen. The other thing is the Asian Development Bank is paying $150 million for electric pylons that will take hydroelectric power from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to the Punjab in Pakistan. Pakistan is always short electricity. The Soviets left a lot of these hydro projects. It's only good in the summer because it freezes in the winter. But you think about it, right now it's free for Pakistan to interfere in Afghanistan. But if 25% of Pakistan, of Punjab's summer electricity comes from these dams across Pakistan, the next time there's a terrorist attack in Kabul, somebody can flip the switch. And you sweat in the dark in Lahore. That's a cost. Right now it's free to interfere in Afghanistan. The other thing that could happen, an even bigger power that's moving, is China has plunked down $3 billion for rights to a copper mine in Afghanistan, and has said it's going to build a railway back to China. What is Pakistan's other ally besides the United States? China. It's one thing to support an insurgency like Mullah Omar if they're shooting at NATO. It's another thing to interfere with Chinese business. I can see some pretty nasty calls and reminders of where do you get your missile technology and nuclear reactors? Us. Cool it. Immediately. So, and then there's the long talked about natural gas pipeline from Turkmenistan down to Pakistan and India. All of these things can or are taking place right now that could change Afghanistan. Because Afghanistan is not an intrinsically poor country. It was deliberately underdeveloped. Amir Abdurrahman said, if I do not develop the country, no foreigners will come here. He was kind of correct. Right? But this is like saying, I will not take a job and go on welfare, that way no thieves will bother me. That is true too. No thieves will come to your house if you're on welfare. Is it a good long-range strategy? No. Afghanistan is just beginning to realize now that it is not an intrinsically poor country, it is an underdeveloped country. Once these developments begin to come up, then throughout the entire region, stability in Afghanistan begins to become much more important than instability. But how can we get out? You know, I mean, how can we leave a stable Afghanistan? And here, I think a look at Afghan history and also previous foreign attempts to deal with Afghanistan is instructive. It turns out that every Afghan ruler installed by an invading foreign army has failed, usually miserably. Why? Because they're all weak personalities. Of course, what person is going to take power on the bayonets of a foreign army unless they are a weak personality? Because the foreigner's not going to choose a strong personality. And so you have Shah Suja, which is almost a lineal ancestor to Karzai. They're kind of very similar psychologically. You had this guy Yaqub rule for 7 months when the British invaded the second time. He signed away like half of the Northwest Frontier province and got depressed. The British fired him. And you had this guy Babur Karmal, the Soviets put in a whip. Every time was the Soviets, the British. If you want to get out of Afghanistan, you can't get out with that kind of ruler. So in the past, what has happened, both the British and the Russians, they go, well, what kind of ruler can hold Afghanistan? And then we go back to a very strong personality, but also one that says, you give me money, you give me arms, I'll cut a deal within Afghanistan. And it turns out that these have been the most successful rulers in Afghanistan. Our problem is we can't get out with a person like Hamid Karzai. And we lost the opportunity of getting rid of him during the election because Afghans said, hey, you selected the president, tell us who you want, we'll elect him. We said that would be interfering in Afghan politics, as if having an army there isn't interference in Afghan politics. But anyway, Karzai's there. But even if he is not overthrown by a military coup, which is a possibility, because we're training this huge army, and we think it's going to sit and do nothing. But his term by the Afghan constitution ends in 2014, the date that we say we're going to hand over to the Afghans. Now the Afghans don't believe he's going to leave, because we said, well, it's written in the Constitution. They said a lot of things are written in the Constitution, okay? Most of which were ignored. But if we begin talking about now that 2014 is not only a transition date for foreign forces to turn over to Afghans, but it's a transition date to turn over to a new administration, and that we will not support Karzai for a third term because it's not in the Afghan Constitution. The Afghans should be thinking about new leadership. Suddenly Karzai becomes a lame duck. Suddenly politics takes a new opening in terms of, well, who could put together Afghanistan and hold it. The other thing that could happen is many of the dysfunctions of the current Afghan government, which is highly centralized, Karzai wants it to be highly centralized. But if you go and say, well, Hamid, with a great person like you, of course the country has to be centralized. You are the George Washington of Afghanistan. Of course, when you step down and somebody else has this highly centralized position, would that be safe? If he begins to think about it, and particularly if his brother in Kandahar begins to think about it, no, it's not safe at all. Suddenly, Mr. I want a centralized government might be, you know, federalism looks kind of good. Because I do not want my enemies to sit in the same position of power. And another thing he's got to think about is it's tough being a ruler of Afghanistan. Since 1901, every single ruler of Afghanistan has either been driven into exile or assassinated. So if you're walking around the palace, like looking at the portraits, which I don't think they have up there, you got to ask yourself, in sort of Clint Eastwood style, am I feeling lucky? I can beat this 110-year-old streak of bad luck. I mean, even the Red Sox didn't go that long without breaking the streak. But it's up to the international community to say, look, the current Afghanistan government structure is not functional. But we don't necessarily have to do anything to replace it. All we have to do is say the Afghan constitution says there will be new leadership. Once that's open, we will get a political dialogue that's far more robust than what we're seeing now. Because as a group of farmers told me when I was north of Kunduz and I was explaining that in America we elected our governors, and they said, well, that's a very dangerous thing because what if you make a mistake? I said, well, after 4 years you're going to elect another one. said, oh, nobody told us that. When we were talking about democracy, we were told we had to make it one time, and that's very dangerous. If they had told us that, we would have been much more in favor of it, you know? We took that for granted. They certainly did not there. So, to sort of wrap up in terms of understanding Afghanistan, while the country has an enormous number of problems, I would say the one thing that's really going for it is the Afghan people, after 30 years of war, of difficulties, what they really want fundamentally is nobody's ideology, but the opportunity to live a normal life. If we can give them a structure so that they can live a normal life, all of these spoilers, no matter what their ideology, no matter what they're supporting, will have no base. But until the Afghans believe that they do have such a future, they'll be hedging their bets. And as long as they're hedging their bets, there will be instability in Afghanistan. Thank you. I think we have time for a few questions. Yes.
So today, I don't know if you've seen the news, but Secretary Gates said that the U.S. government had been a lousy listener to Karzai. That sounds fairly critical of past State Department efforts there, which have been fairly critical. It's the same debate, I guess, we've had in the U.S. government. Basically, do we go with Karzai, or do we try to constrain, tilt against him, and so forth? I was sort of surprised that Gates went so far in that direction. I don't expect you to read his mind, but...
they're being sort of on a charm campaign right now.
Yeah.
You're the George Washington. We should have, when the king died, we should have offered to make him king. I call it a promotion. You're already in the palace, you're halfway there. You can be the great father of the nation, or the paternal uncle of the nation, or something. Our problem, what I would argue, is the United States historically sees every ruler it deals with as indispensable until the day they're gone. Musharraf, how can we deal with Pakistan without Musharraf? Well, Musharraf's gone. Pakistan is still there. Mubarak is gone, and Egypt is still there. One of our problems is that we never get ahead of the curve, and we had a wonderful opportunity during the election of 2009 to say, you don't have to keep Karzai. We tried to preempt a second round of that election, which Karzai could have been defeated. He knew that, that's why he was opposed to it. But we were worried about the instability. So the United States, I think one of its major problems is that it gets wedded to leaders, particularly dysfunctional ones, and then can't imagine who would replace them. Particularly since he, by the Constitution, can't run for a third term. Well, if somebody's got to, we should be thinking about that. We're not. Because that might annoy him if we said, your term is actually up at the end of this time. And that would send a really important signal that we're open to leadership changes. But it's a defect that I've seen in U.S. policy for pretty much everywhere. So we're almost always playing catch up on these kind of issues. Yes.
This might be almost too much of a softball question, but you made more sense in this hour today than I've heard most of the people who have analyzed Afghanistan for the last several years. Who in Washington is listening to you?
Oh, well, no one. Past 18 months of the Obama administration, actually, I have been talking to a lot of people. But as I say, I'm an anthropologist. So we're talking foreign policy. And so when I think, great, they come to me, part of my mind says, no. It means the political scientists have failed. IR experts have failed. The quantitative sociologists have failed. And somebody says, hey, ain't there anybody that even been to this place? Well, yeah, these anthropologists, but they kind of deal with culture and stuff. Well, send them in. I can't be any worse than the guys we've been. So yeah, it's an opportunity, but many of the people that knew Afghanistan, they were making these arguments 10 years ago. But yes, there is, and there is more listening now, but it is very hard to change policies that are sort of set. On the other hand, when people's careers are on the line, they become much more flexible. If you say, look, fire escape, look, fire. You don't have to do much more, all right? Because they have an incentive. And so there's at least more interest now. Unfortunately, it's come in some ways a bit too late, far too late. So, it's a question of, can you work it out? There are some things when I talk about economic development and others that I think, look beyond what we're seeing now as a way to change what's happening on the ground. But it's not easy, and what's more difficult is that the government actually never bothered. It's not that they ignored people who knew something about Afghanistan, they never knew they existed. So, but that, as I say, that's begun to change. Whether it makes any difference or not at this point, hard to say. Yes?
Fascinating talk, and thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be here. Having just come from Washington, having spent maybe 8 years up till August 2010 in Kabul on the political side of things, and trying to interpret what was happening under the surface in Afghanistan back to Brussels and beyond. I would completely agree with you about Afghans wanting a normal life, but we have the massive problem of not just changing actors in Afghanistan, but the depth of structural corruption under which a whole host. I think Gilles Sorrow in Washington summed up corruption as a means for the centre to control the periphery, which I thought was an excellent summary. That's going to require a very long-term partnership with the Afghan people and enabling the Afghans to take some responsibility themselves in the way that we have happening now in a very fascinating way in the Arab world. How do you see that going forward? And is there any interest in Washington? I know there's a lot of interest in how do we move this forward, and in my view, the transition is impossible. There is no one to hand it over to. That's becoming increasingly clear. So where do we go from here?
Well, I would disagree slightly that corruption is being used to hold the periphery. I would say there's two types of corruption. There's state-building corruption, which is a type of patronage, which is traditional in Afghanistan, and also the top guys set the limits. I'm the biggest thief, you're a little thief. You steal too much, I'll take you out. Also, there's a tendency in that kind of system to play true musical chairs, that is, you remove a chair each time. Karzai plays musical chairs, but a chair is never removed. This takes a lot of incentive away from worrying about losing. But what they're engaged in, I would say, is state-destroying corruption. That is, if the money were going to the periphery, it would be buying patronage. That is traditionally ways Afghans have rebuilt states. The money is going to places like Dubai, almost instantaneously. And these are like termites in the structure of the state. And they're all hoping not to be the last termite when it collapses. What I would say, therefore, is that a lot of this corruption is actually not related to governance at all, in some ways. It's anti-governance. And this is one of the things where, talking about process, talk about a coup that takes place, talking about an election that takes place in 2014 without Karzai. This is one of the things that I see it's potentially a generational problem. That you have a younger generation in Afghanistan, the majority of the population was born since the Soviets left. All the people we deal with come from the Mujahideen period. And those are the ones that are sort of up to their eyeballs in corruption. But they haven't used this corruption essentially to build a political framework. And I could see the possibility, whether it's on the streets like in Cairo or more likely a military coup, that it would not just be replacing Karzai, it would take out all of these people whose major, people like Fahim, like Sayyaf, whose major power is the fact that they have connections with the government, lots of money, and nobody to stand in their way. But if that situation were to turn, the most important thing about, I would argue, about state-destroying corruption is that people do it because they do not expect to stay in Afghanistan. They expect to run. And so much of the Afghan government is an expatriate government. They have dual passports. They have places to run. Consequently, they're banking money on the outside precisely because they don't expect to have to defend what they've got on the inside. So one of the things I think we have to be careful of is looking at this, this structure And yes, it's incredibly corrupt, but to some extent, we're the ones that are funding that corruption. But precisely because it is so unstable, removing it might actually improve political stability in Afghanistan, but we're not the ones that are going to do it. But, you know, Afghanistan, if we look at its history, has not been a passive place for the past 60 or 80 years. So what I really wonder about is particularly the urban populations, which are new, younger generation coming up who does have a commitment to being in Afghanistan. They've got no place to go. Is them moving forth and pushing it out. What that would be, I don't know. The other thing would be, I think that the regions are potentially more stable than the center. I think it is easier to come up with regional forms of government and governance in which Kabul plays a lesser role, and you get more stable. Right? We've set up a system that's so highly centralized that when it's unstable at the top, it goes all the way down to the bottom. I think if we focus more at the regional level, people have more self-interest for holding it together. Okay, one more question. Yes?
I have a question about U.S. incentives. So
Yes.
you mentioned that other countries like China have found economic interest. Doesn't it serve to reason that the U.S. and U.S. contractors also are going to see economic opportunities in Afghanistan? And when you talk about creating a system
Yes.
to leave behind, it seems like in addition to any political system to leave behind, there's going to be a corporate system designed to help these corporations and contractors. And, you know, it seems disingenuous to say that the U.S. is there primarily for this political system.
Well,
do you find that to be the case?
Actually not, because I would argue, in theory, yes. If we're a world imperialist power, by God, we should be after the minerals. The interesting thing is, you know, we are bringing stability to Afghanistan so that China and India can have a safe place to invest. Just like I've talked about the termites in the government, I see all of our contractors as essentially short-term. They'll move on to the next disaster, you know. But what I don't see is any American contractor even attempting to develop the resources of Afghanistan, to put together structures that would allow that to happen. It's, in some ways, it's almost counterintuitive. You would think that that's, and certainly the United States has been blamed for going into Afghanistan in terms of getting resources. But if you actually look at what kind of investments the United States has made, the big investments have been made by other countries in the region. They seem to be the ones interested in developing, particularly China, and I would say next India, Afghanistan's resources. Iran has put over $500 million in fixing the infrastructure in western Afghanistan, Herat, to bring it into its economic sphere. What is surprising to me is that I don't see any evidence at all of American corporations being interested in Afghanistan. Now, maybe it's because it's too far away, they don't understand Afghanistan, but what I see is almost entirely short-term contracts that are paid for by the international community. Nothing that will be, leave roots in Afghanistan. And the other things that I talked about, the highway that was built by India to the Persian Gulf, the railway that the Chinese are talking about, these are infrastructures that do have long-term economic consequences. But I see that as more intra-Asian development, that what Afghanistan needs to worry about is how much influence is China and India going to have? Are they going to be able to, are the Afghans going to be able to control their resources? But strangely enough, for all the blood and treasure that the United States has put into Afghanistan, I don't see much in the way of economic benefit coming, nor do I see any plans for that economic benefit. I want to thank everybody for coming, and also if there's more questions, we do have a reception. We have food and drinks, and we welcome everybody to stay and engage in more.